One of my most anticipated games of 2022 has been Callisto Protocol, the survival horror title developed by Striking Distance Studios, the same devs who worked on the original Dead Space games, with even Glenn Schofield, the series creator, at the helm. Well, it's finally here, and one of the few times this year too we haven't had a game that's been delayed multiple times. The so-called next-generation take on survival horror, immersing players in a pulse-pounding story where unspeakable horrors lurk around every corner. Now, we've had no shortage of good survival horror titles recently, with games like Resident Evil Village, Signalis, Tormented Souls, and now even the news of a Silent Hill 2 and Dead Space remake on the horizon. This genre is anything but dead, so Callisto Protocol has some pretty big shoes to fill. The big question then is, does it live up to the hype? Well, let's find out. Brace for impact! Right, so one thing I think Callisto Protocol absolutely nails is its story. The game opens on a colony on the moon planet Europa where some kind of bioweapon's been released, apparently the aftermath of a terrorist attack, and the only person on the scene is a woman named Danny, played by Karen Fukihara, and anyone who's a fan of The Boys is going to revel seeing her pop up here. After that, it then cuts to the main character, Jacob, played by Josh Duhamel, as his ship is attacked by Danny and the Outer Way. The terrorist group blamed for the attack on Europa, and then in all of this chaos, their ship crashes on the nearby moon of Callisto. For reasons unknown, from this point on, Jacob's treated as a prisoner and locked up in Black Iron Prison, which is supposed to be some kind of hellhole full of people so bad that locking them all away on some kind of desolate prison seemed to be the best idea.
Welcome to Black Iron Prison.
Sam Witwer plays an antagonistic prison captain who for some reason just instantly acts like a complete dick towards Jacob, and he's about the closest we get to a villain early on here.
Rise, gentlemen.
Even though he really only shows up like 2 or 3 times.
Him?
You don't get all that much time to speculate what's going on though, because Jacob soon wakes up to find the prison completely overturned, as the same virus which affected Europa has now been unleashed on Callisto, turning people into these horrific looking monsters. And now your only goal is to just get the hell off the planet, though that's easier said than done. And to do this, you'll need the aid of Danny and a fellow inmate named Elias, who really is a bit of a bro of the highest tier.
That's our first stop. Meet me there.
Along with investigating the means behind the outbreak and what Jacob was actually transporting in his ship that entire time.
Okay, fine.
Now, normally I don't like seeing actual celebrities in video games. I find it often kind of disconnects me from the experience, but I think this time it kind of works for the game's favor. Because Josh Duhamel playing Jacob and Karen playing Danny, like, it doesn't feel like they're too distracting in the role. I mean, it's far less distracting than seeing Keanu Reeves in Cyberpunk, for instance, or Kevin Spacey in Call of Duty. I think the only real crime here is that Karen and Sam don't show up more often. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen either of those actors in something I didn't like them in.
Let me see if I got this straight.
Sam was the sole reason I kept playing The Force Unleashed, and the will they won't they dynamic between Karen's character and Frenchie in The Boys is one of the many reasons why I love that show.
Here, take this.
Here though, Danny is barely in the game for the first 2/3 of it, and Sam is in it even less. And I feel like his character could have been a really cool recurring villain, like a Resident Evil style Titan that just keeps popping up to throw a spanner in the works, but as a main antagonist, he's just not around as much as you'd really like.
Why'd the warden want you alive?
That is kind of good news for the overall campaign though, I guess, in the way that this isn't a game that bogs you down with frequent and constant cinematics. I mean, there's 45 to 60 minute long chapters here where you can just slowly jog around to your heart's content without ever being forced to sit through boring diatribe. I mean, yeah, there's quite a few cinematics early on as they're trying to establish everything and introduce all these characters, but even then, like, I think that stuff is pretty interesting to sit through, and I never found myself getting bored with what was happening.
Fuck you!
It's just a bit of a shame you can't skip them, which, you know, is going to be annoying for anyone doing a New Game Plus run. Oh wait, sorry, did I say New Game Plus? Yeah, my bad. There's no New Game Plus mode, but yeah, more on that one later.
Think I got time for this shit?
Now, visually, Callisto Protocol does look pretty damn good at times. The environmental detail can be really high, with nice use of things like water reflections, lens flare, and fog, and the facial animations for the characters is just downright uncanny valley. There's a sequence where you're outside moving through a blizzard, barely able to see in front of you as a thunderstorm rages off in the distance, and the ambience in this scene alone is just amazing. Coming across these horrific mangled corpses or gruesome notes scrawled on walls in blood, I think really captures the tone of this place being this inescapable hellhole. It's a vibe.
That's one hell of a view.
Not to mention, the whole thing is insanely violent. I mean, the gore in this game is just next level. It's common to have Jacob literally covered in blood after combat, and at one point you're even wading through the sewers and covered head to toe in literal shit. Yeah, that kind of encapsulates what it's like browsing through Twitter. And let's just say that some of the executions in this game make the Dead Space 2 eye surgery scene seem like someone getting a pinprick in comparison.
Ouch town population, you bro!
Yeah, this game definitely earns that R18 rating, let's just put it that way. However, that's all kind of ruined by what is just a really crappy PC port. Now, I'm running this game on an i7-10700 with 64GB of RAM and a brand new RTX 4080, and I couldn't even get a steady frame rate on the high settings, let alone ultra. Even still though, the frame rate is often super choppy, dipping frequently when it loads into new areas, and then at other times it just tanks completely, dropping down into the 30s or even the 20s. What eventually kind of fixed it for me, I mean mostly, was changing the game from DirectX 12 to DirectX 11, and bumping a few more of the settings down from high to medium. But I mean, damn dog, for a rig like mine to not even be able to run the game on the high settings, that kind of definitely seems like someone's dropping the ball there on the optimization. And even after doing all that, I still couldn't even read the text on the in-game menu. It was like the font's been covered with ants or something.
Think I got time for this shit?
Yeah, it kind of defeats the purpose too, right, of having an RTX card if I can't even enjoy the resource hogging addition of ray tracing. I've even got a couple of mates who run the game with a 4090, and they had similar performance issues too. Now, I do know the game has de novo, so whether or not that also plays a part in the performance, I've got no idea, but either way, this game doesn't seem to run well. I'll leave the real tech review stuff up to the guys who actually know what they're talking about, but I'm really just hoping this can be fixed with patches because it really undermines what's otherwise a gorgeous looking game. Under all of that though is still an intense survival horror game, which, let's be honest, is all anyone really cares about. And when it comes to that, I think that's something that people are either going to really love or hate. I've seen Callisto Protocol described as a Dead Space successor, which I don't think is entirely true. I mean, yeah, it definitely does have similarities, like the inclusion of being able to stomp on things with your boots that may as well be made out of adamantium. And I love too how every single corpse turns into a blood-filled piñata. You can also shoot off enemy limbs and watch enemies crawl around on the ground. And then another comparison is the user interface, or the lack thereof. Yeah, you see, much like Dead Space, Callisto does away with a heads-up display or anything else which might dampen that cinematic aspect of the experience. And also, like Dead Space, your health is indicated by a meter on the back of your neck. The only problem though is that this thing is much more harder to see than the rig was in Dead Space. The one on the back of Isaac's suit was clearly segmented, ran all the way up his back, and more importantly was easy to spot at a glance. Whereas the one on the back of Jacob's neck is way smaller and harder to see, especially during combat, you know, when you really want to see it. This means I often died way more than I should have, mostly because I wasn't really aware that I was that close to death. Jacob starts off wearing his prison rags, but eventually gets a more protective armored suit that also increases his damage resistance, which, yeah, again, seems kind of familiar. Plus, there's also some minor inventory management to deal with, like selling off contraband at stores to get extra cash. Again, sounds familiar. Another similarity is that Callisto's got a kinetic ability similar to the Kinesis module in Dead Space. We can pick up objects and throw them at enemies. Or this time, even pick up the enemies. Mostly just to throw them into walls of spikes, but there's a few amazing moments here where you can pick enemies up and throw them into fans and other dangerously exposed pieces of machinery. So dangerously exposed that this entire place would be a gold mine for someone looking for easy workers' compensation. The thing is, again, the meter for tracking how much energy you've got left for this thing is again on the back of Jacob's neck. And this thing's even smaller than his health points, making it even trickier to see. And look, I mean, having a minimal heads-up display is fine, but you've got to make sure that the information is still able to be interpreted by the player, which is something I just don't think the game does here. It's not a massive issue when it comes to your health, simply because healing is so fucking slow in this game, so it's not like you're going to be able to heal during combat to begin with. Yeah, it's often to the point that you literally do not have time to heal up during certain sequences, and even trying to is kind of like signing your own death warrant. I feel too like this is one of the many ways where it seems a game's kind of taken influence from The Last of Us, another game where it takes 3 or 4 seconds to fully heal yourself. Here though, instead of a craftable medkit, you're using a healing syringe and jabbing this thing into the back of your neck, and I think I can count the amount of times on one hand I managed to get off a heal during combat. And I think too, in its most important aspect, the combat, it's got even more similarities with The Last of Us. Mostly in the way the game focuses on these heavy-hitting ranged weapons, followed by locking the player into melee combat with a single enemy. The way you essentially snap onto one enemy when you engage them kind of feels similar to running up to a clicker or a bandit as Joel and unloading on them with a plank of wood or a steel pipe. For the guns here, you're pretty limited, and there's essentially 5 weapons in total, 3 of which you swap in and out of the same attachment, with a hand cannon, a shotgun, and an automatic pistol. Your other weapon is a riot gun, which is more or less just another shotgun, and you can also swap out the barrel with this one for an assault rifle. The weapon upgrades are pretty standard fare here, like upgrading the damage, the magazine size, reducing recoil, and all that kind of stuff. And it all sounds good, but the time to swap out these attachments is just ridiculously long, making it really tricky to do effectively during combat. And that right there, that raises some pretty big issues, right? Because if you go into an encounter without having the right weapon ready, you know, something which is likely for a blind run because you have no idea what's coming, well then you just start these combat encounters at an insane disadvantage. You're going to have to quickly swap out to the better weapon, all while these enemies are bearing down on you, which all but then forces you into the melee combat. And this melee combat is a huge component to Callisto Protocol's gameplay, and the main reason, again, why I think it doesn't really play that much like the Dead Space games. Early on in the game, you'll notice you're going to be spending a whole lot of time killing things with a crowbar, and eventually after that you'll come across a stun baton, which more or less works exactly the same, and then becomes your primary melee weapon for the rest of the game.
Stun baton, yeah. Those things do pack a punch though.
With this, it's about as simple as just hitting someone with a standard attack, and then you can eventually unlock a more powerful heavy attack. When an enemy gets in close, they'll go in for a melee hit, and at this point you can either dodge left or right by just simply pressing the left or right buttons, or instead block by pressing backwards. Yeah, block by pressing backwards. I mean, what is this, Street Fighter 2? Sometimes enemies will chain attacks as well, maybe even 2 or 3 hits back to back, so you'll need to read their movements and alternate dodging left or right until they're finally left open for a counter hit. If you can stun an enemy during this combat, an icon pops up revealing a weak point, and then you can shoot that weak point with your equipped weapon for what I assume is a lot of extra damage. And that's pretty much it. I mean, that's basically the entire combat loop and what you'll spend most of the time doing. Simply because Jacob is so fucking slow here that trying to evade enemies just isn't possible. Yeah man, this is not a survival horror game where you run past everything to conserve ammo. You're all but forced into combat almost every time here, and melee's really your main defense, considering most of the enemies are melee focused. And this is all fine and dandy, you know, against a single opponent. But the issue is that once more than a single enemy gets into the fray, it starts to become a bit of a mess.
Gotcha, bitch!
Because while you're essentially locked into this battle for life and death against some horrific looking monster, the other enemies in the background aren't going to be waiting for their turn. The fact the game locks you into these preset angles to prioritize focusing on the one enemy you're actually engaged with also means you lose all situational awareness, and there's nothing to stop these guys from coming from behind you, literally out of your field of vision, and going for the kill.
Surprise, motherfucker!
The whole dodging mechanic is also kind of weird to me. I mean, you don't even need to time it or anything. You just either hold down the left or the right button, and then Jacob's going to dodge at the right time automatically. Funnily enough, it actually makes the boss fights the easiest encounters, because you just hold left and right, and can perpetually avoid their attacks, seeing as that's all they ever try to do to hit you. I almost never really bothered with blocking here, simply because when you block you still take damage, so it seemed easier to just avoid damage entirely as opposed to trying to mitigate it. Later on, when you get more weapons and ammo and upgrade your guns, you can use melee less and less, but there's still going to be times here when you're all but forced into the combat, and it just doesn't really ever seem to advance all that much. The same techniques I used in the first level, I used right up to the end of the game. You know, ducking and weaving, man, like it was Muhammad Ali. I absolutely hate this too, how there's like this delay in animation when Jacob goes from shooting his gun to pulling out his baton. I mean, it is so annoying, man, and why they just can't bypass this for the sake of video game logic is beyond me. For most of the really challenging sequences though, I just often resorted to cheesing through them, by doing things like picking enemies up with a gravity glove and throwing them off ledges. And I just kind of feel, if you have to resort to playing like a bitch to get through fights here, well, I think that speaks volumes about how sloppy those encounters have been designed. The devs describe the combat as being intentionally violent and stressful, with them wanting the player to have a feeling of helplessness and a struggle to survive, which it definitely does. And I'd say the medium difficulty is more like hard mode in any other game. It's just whether or not that translates into your own individual sense of what fun gameplay should be is up to you. If nothing else though, from dying so much, at least you get to appreciate those incredible execution animations, which are so over the top and horrific, they're just hilarious. And again, yes, I hate to pull out the comparison card, but I can't help that this stuff also reminds me of The Last of Us, where it zooms right in to let you see your character's demise in all this slow, methodical glory. And yes, I know Dead Space has executions too, but there's one execution here where Jacob has his face pretty much ripped in half, with his jaw being pulled off in opposite directions, and this is almost identical to what happens in The Last of Us if Joel is ever grabbed by a bloater. I think the main complaint I could make with the combat is that there's just not all that much variety to the enemies. Combat can be insanely satisfying with these really crunchy sound effects, impactful hits, and a real sense that you're really fucking these monsters up. It's just a bit of a shame though that most of the enemies are just some form of something that comes running up to you. The only real standouts is this one that spits out projectiles from a distance, but once you shoot that thing's head off, it engages at close range like the rest of them do anyway. There is this kind of weird spider enemy that can go invisible, and because this is a game made in 2022, we have to have those exploding suicide enemies too. There's a mechanic where enemies can mutate and become more powerful, which seems kind of cool at first until you realize it doesn't really change what they're doing. Just makes them move faster and hit harder, but you still have to deal with them the same manner. Remember back in Resident Evil 4 how you'd shoot an enemy's head off and the last Plagas could essentially mutate at times with a giant scythe coming out of their neck hole? Yeah, well, nothing like that happens here. Even the final boss, which I won't spoil, is just another enemy where you spend the majority of the time dodging left and right. About 2/3 into the game, you're introduced to these blind enemies, and then for a significant portion of the campaign, you're encouraged to crouch walk around and stay hidden. And I think these areas are painful for two reasons. Firstly, because your crouch walking speed is so slow. It's honestly about the speed you get in any other game where you're just like barely pushing forward on the thumbstick. And the second reason I think is that the AI for these enemies is just so unpredictable, but not really in a good way. It's like they rarely patrol in any kind of route, and they'll just randomly do a complete 180 as you're trying to sneak up on them, for no apparent reason. I also find it hilarious how if you make so much as a simple step uncrouched, well, these guys can instantly find you, but somehow they're still completely deaf when you shiv one of them or stomp on one of their corpses. Yeah, makes sense.
What was that noise?
Even if you are detected though, guess what they do? Yeah, they just run right up to you and attack you, which means you deal with them the same way as you deal with everything else. Other enemies include these giant robots, which actually seem kind of imposing at first, with a whole sequence early on there where you've got to just avoid them in their insta-kill machine gun. But then as soon as you get a weapon, they can easily be dispatched by just shooting their head a couple of times, removing that threat entirely. And then you pretty much never see them for the rest of the game.
Have a united day.
Later in the game, you're forced to fight this big two-headed monster mini-boss thing, literally just called a two-head, lol. And as far as I can tell, the only strategy to beat this thing is just to again dodge left and right, trying to get in a shot or two before it attacks again. And it's just repeating that strategy for 2 or 3 minutes until this thing goes down. It shows up maybe 3 or 4 times again too after that, and you just know that when a game starts recycling these super spongy mini-boss enemies that they're really running out of ideas. At this point is where I start to become even more critical of the game, because as much as I like so many aspects of this thing, there's also just so many bad design choices here. For starters, this is one of those games that has you crawling through vents and squeezing through tight gaps, over and over. And I just spoke about this in my Evil West video, which I got fucking roasted over, by the way. And this is a perfect example, yet again, with this weird trend where so many games think that this somehow translates into enjoyable or engaging gameplay. And it doesn't, by the way. It's just like artificial lengthening. The kind of artificial lengthening I've been looking into in my spare time, you know, even though my wife tells me not to worry about it. And I mean, look, if you're the kind of person who likes a sequence where you do little more than just hold down a single button, well, that's fine. Personally, I just kind of find this stuff incredibly boring. I'd rather just walk into a new room and get back to killing something. Squeezing through something, crawling through a vent, crawling through a vent, squeezing through something, squeezing through something, squeezing through something, crawling through shit, squeezing through something. Am I making my point?
Well, I guess you got it all figured out.
Oh, and the worst parts is where you're not allowed to run and have to walk around for whatever reason. These kind of moments are speckled throughout the game too. The checkpoints in the game are also really inconsistent. Sometimes you get them when you enter every second room, but then other times they're so sporadic that you're looking at replaying the last 5 to 10 minutes of game time. What it also does that really pisses me off is that they'll put a checkpoint when you enter the area where the shop is. So what happens is you go through the shop, you sell and upgrade all your weapons, sitting through all those unskippable 3D printing animations, only to then head into the next room and die. Which is fine, but then you reload from that earlier checkpoint and have to go through that whole cycle again of navigating through the store. This could have easily been solved by just putting a fucking checkpoint in the room after the store. You know what else I really hate here too? The amount of cheap jump scares in the game. Half the time you open lockers and chests, there's going to be an enemy inside that just pops out and latches onto you. It annoys me because I have no idea that it's coming, and it also takes off my health points. The worst ones by far are these like tentacle things living inside eggs that pop out and require button mashing to get off, and this happens so often it just becomes nauseating. There's not really any kind of puzzles in the game either, outside of just replacing fuses to get through locked doors, so don't expect this thing to really melt your brain either. But yeah, it's not like anyone really expects to see puzzles in a survival horror game, is it? Most of this stuff I can put up with, but I think the real disappointment for me was the lack of a New Game Plus mode. I noticed early on how the upgrades for the guns were super expensive, and I started to think that maybe the idea here was that you'd max these guns out over multiple runs, you know, like you did in Dead Space. Only when I eventually finished the game, it just threw me back to the main menu.
What is that supposed to mean?
For these developers, the Dead Space developers of all people, to not include a New Game Plus mode, it just kind of feels like sacrilege. And more than that though, like where's all the unlockable weapons, the unlockable game modes, and all the cosmetics? Apparently there's alternate paths you can take later in the game, what the devs call beta paths, but I just don't know if it's worth sitting through the first 5 or 6 hours of the game, just to see how the final 3 or 4 can pan out differently.
Where do you think you're going?
I think my final critique here is that it's just not very scary. And that's coming from someone like me, man, who screams like a little bitch during most horror games. I think there was maybe 1 or 2 times here where the game made me jump, and a couple of the areas do have some spooky sequences, but I'd hardly compare this thing to the pants-shittingly terrifying vibe that the Dead Space games have. Playing Dead Space would often literally have my chest thumping from how intense it was, and I don't know if I'm getting older and my reflexes are getting slower, but the multitude of jump scares in Callisto Protocol that were clearly trying to scare me, you know, it just did nothing. At the end of the day, Callisto Protocol definitely feels like a labor of love, but that doesn't excuse its faults. I would still have a hard time not recommending this thing, mostly because I'm a bit of a survival horror simp, but anyone who says it's this perfectly crafted experience is just lying out of their ass. Despite my issues, I enjoyed most of my time here. I think the story, the visuals, and some aspects of the gameplay were really fun, but the lack of a New Game Plus mode just didn't really make me want to come back for a second viewing. But if all you wanted to do was stomp on space zombies and cover yourself head to toe in arterial fluid, well, you can still do that, just expect it to be a bumpy ride.
No!